Welcome to the Explainer. So economics often gets a bit of a bad rap, right? People think it's just a bunch of dry, dusty charts and incredibly complex math equations. But honestly, scratch that. At its core, economics is basically just a practical toolkit for observing and understanding human behavior. It's really all about how we make choices in a world where resources are limited.
Okay, let's just quickly check out our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 key areas: the language of economics, formulating economic laws, the ceteris paribus catch, positive versus normative economics, and finally, micro versus macro perspectives.
Section 1. The language of economics, building our foundational vocabulary. We absolutely have to start with the baseline language here, because words you casually use every single day actually carry very specific, powerful meanings to an economist.
Take our first term, for example, utility. Now, you might hear that and think of a utility knife, something objectively useful. But to an economist, utility is the expected want-satisfying power of a good. The real kicker here is that utility is entirely subjective to the user, and crucially, it diminishes with each additional unit you consume. Think about it like this. The satisfaction, or the utility, you get from eating an orange when you are absolutely starving is huge, but by the time you're forcing down your 6th orange, you're getting way less utility out of that one. Economists actually call this the law of diminishing marginal utility.
And that naturally brings us to the concept of value, which perfectly sets up a pretty famous economic paradox. On one hand, we have use value. This is based on high necessity. Think about water. It has immense utility, it literally keeps you alive, but it usually has a very low exchange value in the market. Contrast that with exchange value, which is driven heavily by scarcity and the cost of production. Diamonds are a great example here. They aren't keeping anyone alive, but they are scarce. So, life-saving water is cheap, while decorative diamonds are incredibly expensive.
Now let's categorize what we're actually buying and selling. Goods. We basically have 3 main buckets. First, consumption goods. These satisfy household wants directly. Second, intermediate goods, which are used as inputs for producing other things. And third, capital goods. This is machinery or equipment you can use more than once for production. But you know what's really fascinating? Goods can actually jump between these categories depending entirely on how they're used. Like the LPG gas you use to cook dinner in your home kitchen, that's a consumption good. But if you take CNG and put it in a commercial taxi, boom, it becomes a capital good.
We can also sort goods by the intensity of the wants they satisfy. Obviously, we naturally prioritize necessities. These tackle our most basic, intense needs, like hunger or staying warm. Next up are comforts, which basically just help increase our working capacity and make life a bit easier. And finally, luxuries. These satisfy our least intense wants and are mostly about social prestige. But keep in mind, this isn't a rigid system. One person's absolute luxury might be another person's daily necessity depending on their circumstances. Plus, these categories completely shift for the exact same person over time.
To round out our vocabulary, we have to talk about the heavy hitters: demand and supply. Normally, the general rule is that when prices rise, demand falls. Pretty straightforward, right? But human behavior is messy and complex. For example, the sheer fear of scarcity can trigger panic buying, driving food demand way up, even as prices are skyrocketing. Or think back to those diamonds. Sometimes a wildly high price actually drives demand up because buyers want to flex their wealth and prestige. It flips the standard rule completely upside down.
Part 2. Formulating economic laws. How economists make sense of behavior. So now that we've got the vocabulary down, let's look at the rules of the game and see how economists actually construct these theories.
Economists essentially act like detectives here, and they typically rely on 2 types of reasoning. First, there's deductive reasoning. This is where you start with hypothetical assumptions to predict outcomes. For instance, assuming people will behave rationally to formulate the law of demand. Then you have inductive reasoning, which works in reverse. You start by gathering real-world empirical facts to find the patterns. A brilliant example of this is Ingalls' law. Ingle actually looked at real family budgets and discovered that as income rises, the overall proportion of that income spent on basic necessities drops. And fun fact, most businesses actually lean heavily towards this real-world inductive approach.
Moving on to Part 3, the ceteris paribus catch, the messy reality of social sciences. There is a massive, massive catch when we formulate these generalized economic laws.
Because unlike planets or molecules, we are dealing with totally unpredictable human beings. Economics is definitely not physics. We cannot just lock people in a perfectly controlled laboratory experiment. Because of that, every single economic law comes with a foundational caveat: ceteris paribus. It's Latin for other things being equal.
Basically, we have to assume that no sudden outside forces are going to swoop in and ruin our expected outcome. The actual reliability of any economic law entirely hinges on that assumption holding true.
Now, when we apply these laws in the real world, we're generally hunting for a very specific state. When all those messy, opposing economic forces pushing and pulling finally balance each other out, we hit a state of peace that economists call equilibrium. It's the moment the value of a variable, like the price of a cup of coffee, just stops changing because the upward and downward pressures are perfectly matched.
Section 4. Positive versus normative economics. Describing reality versus improving it. This brings us to a super important crossroads. Why do we even study all this? Are we just sitting back and observing, or are we actively trying to fix things?
The crucial distinction to make here is the difference between a positive statement and a normative one. A positive statement just tells it like it is. It simply describes reality without any judgment. For example, saying an increase in the price of petrol leads to a fall in quantity demanded. That's just a raw statement of fact. A normative statement, on the other hand, makes a value judgment. It asks what ought to be done to actually improve our material well-being. So a normative approach would be saying the government should take steps to cut the consumption of petrol. Normative economics is where we put our theories to work to try and actively make society better. Finally, Part 5, Micro versus Macro Perspectives, the two lenses of economic analysis. To figure out what ought to be done, economists have to choose exactly which lens they want to look through.
Lens number 1 is microeconomics. Derived from the Greek word mikros, meaning small, this lens zooms way in on the behavior of individual elements. We're talking about a single household, one specific firm, or the price of a single product. Microeconomics is basically your magnifying glass. It lets you see exactly how decisions are made regarding your own personal wallet.
Lens number 2 is macroeconomics. Coming from the Greek word makros, meaning large, this lens zooms way out to look at the entire economy as a whole. It studies massive aggregate variables, things like national income, general price levels, and overall employment. If micro is the magnifying glass, macro is the wide-angle lens. It looks at the entire nation's health because at the end of the day, your individual prosperity is tied to a healthy overall system. But here's where things get incredibly tricky. You cannot always just add up micro behaviors and expect the macro result to perfectly match. Sometimes they conflict entirely. Let's say you, as an individual, decide to drastically increase your savings. That builds your personal wealth. Awesome, right? But what if literally everyone in the entire economy decides to hoard their savings at the exact same time? Overall demand drops, prices fall, and the whole economy actually shrinks. Same thing goes for buying. If one person buys more of a good, they get what they want. But if everyone rushes out to buy more, aggregate prices just get driven straight up. Regardless of whether you are looking through that macro, wide-angle lens or the micro magnifying glass, every single decision you make comes with an opportunity cost. This is a huge concept. It's the value of the next best use for an economic item. Essentially, it's the incredible alternative you had to sacrifice in order to take your chosen path. Every single choice has a cost, even if you never actually open your wallet to spend a dime. Which brings us to the end of our foundational journey today. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. If normative economics asks what ought to be done to improve our material well-being, how will you use these tools? Now that you've got the vocabulary, a solid grasp of the reasoning, and both the micro and macro lenses at your disposal, how are you going to use this economic toolkit to actually shape the world? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.